How's it going, everyone? So, before we dive into the episode, I really want to say thank you to everyone that is listening in, that's tuning in, that's enjoying this content and getting value from it. I really love that. That's why I do it. But there's a huge amount of you that are listening that are not subscribed, not following the podcast. And I really want to encourage you to please follow and subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you are listening or viewing this on. It really helps out the podcast. It helps out the algorithm. It helps more people hear this content that you already find helpful and that they hopefully will as well. So if you go ahead and subscribe or follow the podcast on any platform that you're listening on, and please share it with your friends, that'll be great. All right. Thanks, everyone. Let's get into the episode. How's it going, Amish? It's great to finally get you on the podcast. We've been planning this thing for a while, and coincidentally, like my kid just tends to get sick every time we do it. So thankfully, today she's finally not sick.
It's good to hear, Joe. Great meeting you. And yes, I'm looking forward to this chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we start with how you got into IT, right? Just IT overall. What made you want to go down that path? What was it about you that kind of interested you, in the field and whatnot?
Well, growing up, I was always intrigued by what was happening around me as far as new things in technology. I remember a very clear memory of being in high school, and this was back home in India. There was no internet back then, it's difficult to imagine right now. But I distinctly remember Time Magazine designating the computer as the man of the year, if you will.
Hmm.
Got my attention. National Geographic carries this cover story about microchip being the most important innovation in a long time. So I started to get intrigued about what used to be referred to as electronics, if you will. And that got me into the whole tech game. So went studied electrical engineering and got interested in communication networks actually back then. Again, it was one of those really crazy moments when one of your alumnus comes back to and talks to you and said, "Hey, this is something that's cool." And that's how I got interested in networking and eventually in IT.
Yeah, it's fascinating how people got into it back then at that time, right? Because it was kind of such a new thing. Like today, the people that are starting to get into it today, right, that are at the beginning of their career, they've never lived without the internet. They've never really lived without a cell phone, like in the marketplace, in their house. Like at least when I was growing up, I mean, a cell phone, like that wasn't even in our vocabulary, basically. Like cell phone. What am I going to do with that? I have a house phone. Call my house if you want to get a hold of me, you know?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the rotary phone world where half the times you'd get wrong numbers because the dial has dust stuck inside it. So, but anyway, fast forward. Actually, thanks to an Uber driver I was once with, who reminded me that the first app actually was developed in 2007.
Hmm.
2007 is not that long ago. So the pace of change is definitely something that is extremely, extremely rapid. And that's what makes it exciting. I think that's what makes it exciting to be in this space in IT and specifically in cyber.
Wow. The first app was developed in 2007. I didn't even realize that. That
Neither did
is,
I until my Uber driver once told me.
that's wild. I mean, I was in high school 2007, that's crazy how quickly this field has kind of exploded. Did anyone from what you remember, did anyone back then kind of think that it was going to become what it is today?
Obviously
Even in
not.
like magazines or anything
Nobody
like
ever
that?
predicted. I'm sure there were sci-fi writers who were thinking about, flying saucers and augmented reality and all of that. But nobody ever thought that we would be in this age where suddenly, you didn't have to write a paper, ChatGPT wrote it for you. You didn't have to lift your finger and food shows up and, stuff shows up reliably and, within the hour of what is predicted. So we've come a long, long way from where we were. But I don't think when you don't have what you don't know, it's not like you miss it. But obviously, we're all better off with innovations that we've all helped develop together.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that you bring up. And for some, I guess maybe some interesting reason, my mind goes to like the uncontacted tribes in the Amazon, right? Like people that are still back in like the Stone Age, essentially, that don't want outsiders. I mean, I guess they have very valid point for why they don't want outsiders, because their immune systems are very vulnerable compared to ours. And it's fascinating, right? Because you would think injecting technology, injecting modern medicine and things like that would improve their lives, but it actually impacts them in different ways, and they're kind of, very against it, right? Like they're pushing against that grain to say like, no, we want to stay, like this, and they also don't know what they're missing. So if you don't know what you're missing, you're not missing anything.
That's exactly it, right? It's a matter of perspective. And actually, the reverse of it is true when it comes to people like us who are in tech, especially. You haven't seen anything until you've actually come to a place like the San Francisco Bay Area, right? It's just something that I had read about it. I had thought about what it would be like, but it was completely different. The part that actually completely blew me away was, first of all, how small it was geographically. It's such a small area. And the other part that's always fascinated me is about how it's not a zero-sum game, right? Everybody here is from somewhere, and everybody here got their start from nothing. So we sort of feel obligated to help others to get going as well. And that's the part that really got me into that whole idea of, hey, we've constantly got to push ourselves to build something better because somebody else did it before us.
How do you start from nothing?
It's amazing. You literally just walk down the street and you go to a leasing office. Back then, I'm talking about today, I don't think you would do that, but yeah, I literally just walked down to a place and said, I need space. They did not ask me for my credit record. They did not ask me for references. They just said, here's the suite, and this is what you have to pay every month. And that's it. I had a place. Now I could get people over to start brainstorming. Everything is just, based on mutual trust. I mean, they didn't want to worry about whether this guy will be around or not pay his rent next month. This is how everybody gets started around here.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me because, that's a scary undertaking. And it's, well, I guess it's less scary the younger you are, I would say. Right? Like now I have a 1-year old at home, right? I have a wife, I have a mortgage. I can't just quit everything and start over, completely fresh. Like even if I were to do that, it's like, okay, you need to empty out your retirement and utilize all of your savings. And this is your burn period and all that. Uh, it's a really fascinating area and time in someone's life when they kind of identify that, where it's like, hey, I have, very limited responsibilities right now. So why don't I throw my whole self into this thing and see where it takes me?
Yeah. So by the way, it's still scary. I mean, we're all responsible adults, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to depend on somebody else. But there's some secrets there that you need to unlock in order to get there. First of all, you know, get a partner in life that is more accomplished than you are. Number one. Number two, somebody who you can depend on. So when I decided to do that, I had two things going for me. First, I had a wife who had a very steady job, and I didn't have to worry about the mortgage or worry about the bills. And secondly, I had a boss who was extremely supportive. I still remember distinctly, when I came to actually quitting and wanting to go down the entrepreneurial path, which I did about 7 years into my journey. I went to my boss and said, I'm still scared. And he said, you know what? Just go take the chance. Just go do it. And if you don't like it, come back in a month. And
Mm.
that's all you need, right? That's a lifeline. And I never turned back after that. But again, I always feel very blessed to have both of those things that help me get started.
Yeah, that's a very unique situation, maybe not too unique, right? Where your boss, told you take a month and give it a try, and if it doesn't work out, come back, right? There unfortunately there's some bosses out there that would say that's never going to work. Don't waste your time. Like, I think, when Jeff Bezos was starting Amazon, his boss and his friends were all telling him like, you have a good life. You're you're not going to duplicate it outside. Why are you going to create something from nothing? They were telling him not to do it, not to take that risk. Now it's really hard to imagine a world without Amazon. I mean, like AWS, it's hard to imagine a world without AWS. Jeff Bezos obviously didn't found AWS or whatever. The name AWS is synonymous with Amazon now. You can't I don't buy anything before I check it on Amazon first. Is it available on Amazon? Is it cheaper on Amazon? Do I get it faster on Amazon? And if it meets those things, I'm getting it on Amazon, right? Like, and I'm sure millions of others people do that exact same thing.
Yeah, but this is what I tell everybody that I happen to mentor, right? If it's somebody coming out of school, somebody just starting their job, getting comfortable around, having a job, or sometimes uncomfortable and wanting to quit. You always want to challenge yourself. One of the things that I always done very early in life, and I saw it being done, right? I saw it, my father doing it all the time, where if he felt like he was in a comfort zone, he was always trying to get out of it. We're all trained to actually fall into our comfort zones, that stay within that. But as soon as you do that, you are limiting yourself. So every time you feel that, you want to break out of that mode and you want to challenge yourself. And it's amazing how once you do that, you feel so empowered. You feel like you can do anything at that point because you broke out of your comfort zone and you did something that was uncomfortable. I mean, most uncomfortable thing that anybody can do is selling a product or selling yourself, first of all. It never comes naturally to anyone. And no matter what your personality is, I know there's some people who are born salesmen, but if you really ask them, it didn't come to them naturally. They developed it. But it is, again, it's something that you have to do because it's the most difficult thing to do out there. Cold calling, approaching somebody at a party and just say, hey, what's up? But you have to do that. You have to break out of that comfort zone.
Yeah, you bring up such a good point. you know and I look at this in my own life, and sometimes I try to, like, almost like check myself at the door, right? Like, hey, why are you getting uncomfortable right now? You have a good job, you have a good thing going on right now. Why are you trying to switch everything up? And it's something about, being comfortable for too long. It's okay to be comfortable in your current situation, right, for a certain amount of time. That certain amount of time can be different for everyone. I give myself, 1 to 2 years, right? But at some point you're not going to grow anymore, and when you don't grow anymore, there's some people that get very comfortable in that situation. They stay because it's what they've always known. It's a stable job, and they don't venture outside of that, right? But the people that, when they get comfortable and they start pushing themselves to learn new things, they tend to grow a lot more, and they end their life at the end of, their career or their life, right, in a very different place than where they ended up. And if you were to ask them if they regretted it, they would say, more than likely that they didn't regret it. And
Irrespective of the outcome, right?
yeah,
Irrespective of the outcome, you may fail, but you never regret it. That's the
yeah,
beauty.
I think even, even in failure, even if you put everything into something, and you truly believed in it, right, and it didn't work out, that's not a failure. You just learn something about yourself. You learn something potentially about, that industry that it didn't work in, or whatever it might be. Failure isn't always, as cut and dry as, did I make money from this thing? Did I become rich from this thing, or did I not? I feel like it's not as cut and dry.
And that's the other thing about a place like Silicon Valley, right? You're not judged based on outcomes. I mean, to some extent, everybody gets judged based on some outcomes, But in a place like this, you always have another chance. You always have the ability to go to the next thing, having the lessons learned from the previous experience, good or bad.
Yeah, that's probably why for a while there, I mean, maybe it's still going on even like in the big tech Silicon Valley companies, Facebook, Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, their employees would rotate between those companies typically like every 6 months even. And it was a very common thing that I was, reading about is because they as long as like you're not the culprit of a breach, that cost them a whole bunch of money and now you're before, Congress, right? As long as that doesn't happen, which is far less than 1%, you're able to take those lessons learned and bring them over here, and you can transform processes, you can adjust, how the business is running so that those same mistakes are not going to affect, your new company or whatnot. And it's not as accepted everywhere else, even, within the country, right? Because I remember a time when I was working for a credit bureau, the CISO hired someone from a company that recently had a massive breach at that time. Right? And the company before that he was at that large company that had the breach also had a breach. So this guy went through two massive breaches that, everyone in the country, you if you name the company, everyone would know it, right?
Yeah.
Probably even worldwide. Everyone really kind of critiqued our CISO for bringing in this guy, because we're like, what's he going to teach us? Like how to do it wrong? But everywhere else, or at least in Silicon Valley, that mentality is completely different.
Well, and it's spreading, right? Even within tech now, that all of that is spreading because we know that we are fighting a war where the adversary actually has unlimited budget and unlimited number of people that they can throw at it, right? That's what nation state actors are. So that's where we're always playing catch up from a security perspective. And that's where we feel that, something needs to change. You're starting to see this already actually in security now. SIM was something that was considered to be the standard way to actually monitor threats. And now it's being reimagined. It's a new way of looking at threats. I think that's a good beginning because as the industry evolves and we're at 100 billion going to 225 billion in 4 years in terms of cybersecurity budgets, we'll have to reimagine how we are doing things because the fact is breaches are not stopping, and that's
A lot
really
of the
something
times
that
they're increasing.
they're always increasing and getting more and more punitive as well, right? They're becoming more difficult to manage, even at the individual level. So we have to reimagine how we protect sensitive assets in the cloud.
Yeah, in security, we always say, our job security is based on the last big breach that was in the news, right? Because it's very easy for you to justify why you're there, what you're working on, the budget that you need, when you can point the finger and say, hey, look at that. They're our competitor. They're in the exact same space as us. They had a similar security stack as us, and they got breached. See, this is why I'm asking for the additional 50 million to go and augment the security stack. It's a huge, huge selling point.
Yeah, well, but as solution providers, we tend to avoid a lot of that ambulance chasing. I'm sure this happens from an internal perspective, justify budgets. What we really believe is from a design perspective or from an innovation perspective, we want to make sure that we enact proactive controls rather than continue to invest in reactive controls all the time. If we architect something right and we make sure that you have what is known as a assumed breach posture, which means that you are assuming that things are going to go bad and somebody's going to get into your network. We want to design the pipeline in such a way that the sensitive data, even though it is stolen, it's useless.
Hmm.
That's what we really are trying to do from a from a data pipeline design perspective.
Hmm. That's really fascinating. So let's dive into it a little bit. Let's talk about the company that the company that you're doing this work with, right? And what's the problem set that you're solving, and what's the solution?
So the problem set is that infrastructure, which used to be something that was, very, very locked down and completely immune to anybody getting in back in the day with mainframes, for example, or owned data centers where you had to go in there. I remember back in the day, when I was first starting out in college, you had these mainframes and you had to go and punch cards, drop the cards off, and come back the next day to pick them up.
Wow.
Now, that those days are the most secure because there's nothing leaving that particular environment unless you had the ability to get inside the building and take things. Well, for good or bad, those days are gone and everything is everywhere. So the most important problem that we solve is that when you have your sensitive data in infrastructure that you don't control, you want to make sure that nobody else has access to that data other than yourself. And this is where cryptography really helps, because if you are able to secure your data by encrypting it with a key that you control, nobody else can see the data unless you authorize them or you go in there and actually use the key to retrieve the data. Problem with that particular scenario is that once the data is locked down, you cannot manipulate it, you cannot process it. So what's the use of having an asset that you cannot use, right? So that's where the second innovation comes in, where we have figured out how we can actually process that data without still revealing it in the data store environment where the administrator of that infrastructure can see the data. So the category is called privacy enhanced computation, or the more simplistic term is data centric security, because you're securing the data all the way down at the record level. And you're keeping it secure so that it fails safe. If something really bad happens, somebody gets in there, they only get encrypted data. So encrypted data is useless from the perspective that you can see it, but more importantly, it also does not trigger any kind of notification requirement. So you don't have to tell anybody you were breached because you only lost encrypted data.
Hmm.
So it helps you from a lot of different perspectives, but most importantly, you're able to control your assets on infrastructure that you don't know.
Hmm. So is this similar to homomorphic encryption?
In principle, yes, because of the fact that homomorphic encryption is really defined as being able to encrypt data and then discard the key. You can throw away the key, but you can still process it. It's a very fascinating technology. It's been around for a long time, in academia especially, but it's never been practical because it slows things down by a factor of a million sometimes. And all the computers in the world cannot really do much to accelerate it because cryptography is designed to make sure that it's very difficult to process data that is encrypted. There's lots of optimizations that have been developed over time. One of them is what we pursued. We actually call our technique secure multi-party compute, where what we're really doing is taking a secret, a piece of data, for example, and splitting up the operation of manipulating that data into multiple pieces. So if you steal one or a few of these, call them shares, you'll only get part of the secret. So you cannot reconstruct the data. You would have to compromise all of it, which just makes it so much harder compared to what it is today, where you can just go in there and steal a piece of data from a data store. So that's the whole race that we are in, right? What we want to do is we want to make sure that the need and the ability to actually compromise secrets takes effort that is a lot more than what it's worth. You always want to keep ahead in that race. That's really our job as security professionals, to make the job of the hacker harder than it is and make it as unprofitable as it is.
What would be a technological development that would, potentially give hackers like the upper hand against this sort of technology, right? Because it's like a cat and mouse game, right? Where, the hackers, find a new way to do something. They have more computation power. They have more, zombie computers to do a larger DDoS or whatever it might be, right? And then the technology side of it picks up and it eliminates all of those threats, right? But then sometimes the hackers find a new way of handling it. Is there something like maybe supercomputers or quantum computers that you could think of, right? That may pose a risk to this, or is it more of a like a post quantum resistant technology?
Yeah, let's talk about two things actually, technology and people. Technology part is relatively straightforward. Quantum absolutely has the potential of breaking encryption. In fact, if some people said it's already broken it from the perspective of breaking PKI, not necessarily symmetric encryption, but it does definitely affect asymmetric encryption. But now we already have algorithms that are quantum safe. We're trying to catch up in that race to make sure that that doesn't happen, because a lot of people are doing, a lot of hackers are doing what is known as harvesting. They store encrypted data, waiting for quantum to show up so they can eventually decrypt it. I think we're mitigating a lot of those risks by developing quantum safe technologies. And I think technologies will continue to always keep pace because there's a lot of incentive to go do that. The part that is more difficult is people. Most of the hacks happen because people are irresponsible. They just take shortcuts for business reasons to ignore security practices, like encryption, for example, until it is absolutely necessary to do it. And that's where compliance really, really helps, because now you have another set of capabilities, another set of controls that come in to make sure that such things don't happen. You make sure you have to go through checklists and make sure that those particular data stores are encrypted. So that will change behaviors. I think the other part that's also very interesting is, and we talk to security practitioners all the time, I think what is happening is investment in security are being perceived more and more as competitive differentiators. Back to this issue of, oh, your competitor just got breached, how safe are you? The fact that you are adapting to and adopting better controls is considered as a competitive advantage. Fear only goes so far, right? If it's a necessary evil to do something, people will always drag their feet. If it makes them look better, there's a better chance that they will adopt those kind of controls. So that's where I feel like, while technology will always be there and will always keep improving, the attitudes and the approaches of individuals, of people, are definitely changing, which tells me that we're going to do the right thing going forward.
Hmm. Yeah, you bring up a very interesting point there that, I was having this conversation with someone else recently. They were saying that the technology or the security of these systems are significantly better than they used to be. And they're so secure now that attackers don't even spend that much time trying to get in via old methods of, doing a port scan and seeing what's available and trying to manipulate, requests in certain ways, right? They just go straight to the people and try to fool the people as best as they can to get access, because they'll spend so much time doing the technical route that it doesn't even make sense to spend that much time on it up front.
You're only as strong as your weakest link, right? And in this case, people are the weak link. Yes, technology definitely has some weaknesses as well. Supply chain vulnerabilities are a big thing and they're well known, but everybody has really, really good controls now. Every time you release something, you have to go through all of those testing. It's becoming more and more automated. AI is helping tremendously in that area as well. So I think it's about the people. Um, that's where we need AI to really help. If we can make sure that people get alerted about certain things that happen around them when they get phished. So I think there's a lot of potential there as well.
Is there any limitations with your solution with large data sets? I ask it specifically because, when you think of encrypting, let's say a SQL server, right? You're not going to encrypt the entire hard disk of a SQL server because the performance is significantly degraded. You encrypt, rows and sometimes a whole table, but you'll typically do rows and columns of sensitive data and encrypt it that way, right? But maybe because this is a quantum resistant solution, it doesn't have the same problems as full disk encryption speed issues have. Have you seen anything like that, or
So this is where the cloud really helps, right? The one of the biggest reasons why we exist is because of the cloud. Infrastructure is so much easier to obtain because of the fact that it's all on demand, and the configuration aspect of it. Containerization is something that is really important and useful when you're putting in this kind of capability. Yeah, to answer your question about scale, the biggest reason why we believe we have no limitations of scale is because we use cloud resources. We are instantiated in the cloud, in the customer's environment. We are able to scale with the infrastructure as it is deployed. And it's adaptive, network load balancing, containerization, failover, all of that happens because of cloud technologies that are now available at scale. Full disk encryption actually had a different purpose. There was a reason why you would do full disk encryption back in the day, because disks were getting stolen or lost. Nobody has a data center in their basement anymore, right? The data centers are centralized, they're locked down, they're physically very secure. So even if you had that capability, it is useless. What you want to protect is the data while it is being manipulated, while it's being used. And that's where the column level and row level encryption is the way to go. In terms of performance impacts and whether you want to do all of it or none, well, obviously doing all of it is the easiest way to do it, right? Because you don't have to worry about what part is sensitive and what part is not. But, it has implications about how it is processed and everything else that goes with that. So it becomes a cost versus performance trade-off. What we like to suggest is find the data that is sensitive and then protect it using these scalable techniques so that the volume of data from the number of rows you have shouldn't matter. If you talk about the other dimension, in terms of columns of data, there may be some data that is not sensitive, and there's no reason to encrypt it. And that's where we like to make sure that the customers have control of granularity. It's not an all or nothing thing. You want to pick what you want to protect, but what you are protecting, you want to protect it throughout its life cycle, from creation, use, to when it's discarded.
now with I guess legacy encryption, there's it's highly dependent upon the usage of keys and the security of those keys. Is there any key usage that is dependent with your solution, or does this solution take keys completely out of the mix?
Now, again, we're utilizing existing key management mechanisms, which have been there, which have been standardized, which are extremely secure. Right, the whole HSM process and KMSs that were created are very secure. It's just that nobody utilizes them to the full. Right? Keys become dormant. You don't rotate them often enough. You don't put them in the right places. All of those things are what we have addressed very well. We also use envelope encryption, so you don't have to re-encrypt the data every time you are rotating the key. So what we are able to do really is to put security best practices into action without creating a tremendous amount of operational overhead. You set up the policies, you define what your sensitive data is, you say how often the keys are be rotated. Everything happens automatically. We manage that whole process. You don't need to actually do it manually. And that's where, again, the operational efficiencies are the most important benefit of using our solution is over the long term.
I gotta say, it's really impressive that you're this technical, that you're this in the weeds, that you're able to speak to the solution this well. This is not an easy topic to talk about. Encryption is always, maybe the last thing that I want to study for a test, right? It's the thing that I hope that I somehow get right, and that I don't have to learn it too much. I remember when I was studying for my ISC squared certs, I spent the majority of my time on the encryption part, right? Because it was just so difficult to conceptualize and understand. What sources helped you learn encryption? Because I mean, what we're talking about right now is legacy encryption, something that everyone has done, and now we're talking about a new solution that is quantum resistant, right? That is kind of almost being invented as we create it. Like that's really what we're talking about here. And so it's extremely difficult to understand and like comprehend it, right? Like tomorrow, if you were to ask me what we were talking about, I would probably say I'm not sure, because not because I forgot about it, but because I don't like I stand it in the moment, right? But then regurgitating it and understanding it in a day is a totally different story. So how did you
Well,
pick up this skill set and how did you learn it?
I highly recommend that you do that, right? The regurgitating part and teaching somebody else is the best way to learn. Well, obviously, I give my team a lot of credit. My co-founder is a mathematician. He's extremely knowledgeable about the space. And then as we build the team, I always paid attention to how we were building it. And I always wanted to break it down to how I can actually explain it to somebody else, especially a customer. So that's a skill that you always want to have, which is that you have to be able to regurgitate it and be able to field questions as well, because that's what happens all the time on customer calls. Like, why is it important? Why? How does it actually work? You don't have to get into the weeds. I don't have to write the formulas, but at least I need to understand the concept of exactly how we developed it, how it works. What I like to do is actually break it down to simple pictures that I draw and then validate it. I've always validated because I don't want to make anything up. So it's been a fascinating journey. We've really built something that we're really proud of. But I can also tell you that, the core technology is something that you build in the early days. Most of the work after that is just about adaptation. You know, there's so much change. Again, going back to what we talked about this at the start of the podcast, which is, the pace of change is just relentless. Every cloud has a slightly different variant, of how they do orchestration, how they do key management, how they do containerization. And that's what we deal with a lot on a day-to-day basis. The core technology was something we developed in the early years, and we are able to defend it quite effectively all through it.
Yeah, you bring up your co-founder being a fantastic mathematician, right? And I remember getting into IT, right? And going down that path. I never, I never would have guessed that a mathematician would play such a pivotal role in IT, right? In technology overall. But, truly they're kind of, the unsung heroes of all of our underlying security and tech. Like if the mathematicians get it wrong, right, with the encryption protocols and whatnot, then there is no security. There is literally no data encryption. There's nothing you can do about it, you know?
Yeah. Well, all of us going through high school always hated basic sciences, right? So math and physics is what drives tech for the most part. And again, it goes back to the one thing that I always had, which has helped me, is I always want to know about the big picture. When you're learning about a math algorithm or encryption, and you don't have the vision of, hey, someday I can prevent breaches if I learn this, it's boring. It's not interesting. And that's where, media and, back in the day, printed media had such a big impact. You see something like, this is a magazine cover. This is cool. If I can be part of it, it's probably something that would be exciting. That's a very important thing to have. Always try to look for the big picture. Don't get mired in the details and forget about why you're doing what you're
Yeah, that's extremely important. For me, as a cloud engineer, it is very easy to get just thrown into the weeds, and you come up for air and it's like, man, I don't even know what I'm working towards. Like I don't know why I'm doing all this stuff. And that's a very common thing on the technical side of security. And I feel like it may even be the opposite problem for like the architects necessarily, right? Because, and I'll give you an example. My current architect, created a fantastic reference architecture for the entire environment, of where everything is positioned and everything like that, right? Well, I was looking at it and I was looking at it from a technical perspective, from an engineering mindset. And I'm just saying to myself, when would I ever reference this? It's a reference architecture, right? But when would I ever actually reference this in any of the in the weeds sort of work, right? And it's important to have that blend. It's important to be technical, to be able to handle the technical side of things, but to also relate it in a overarching, bigger picture sort of thing. And I guess that's where, CISOs come in, right? They kind of take it from all the people that are in the weeds that don't really come up for air ever, and they translate it into consumable, PowerPoints, right? And consumable slides for the executives to understand what's actually going on at the company.
And you got to be able to fly up and down, right? Go from
Yeah.
10K to the 50K level and back downs. And I think the biggest job of the CISO is always to justify it from a business perspective. If they just put security up front as a good practice, it's not likely to get as much mileage because the CFO doesn't really understand why they have to do certain things. If they can clearly outline the business benefit, which in this case is very easy to do, right? You're making your sensitive data consumable, especially in this AI era where you're required to share data now. Earlier it was a choice. Now it's a necessity. You have to send your data to an LLM to be able to get better outcomes. Being able to justify it based on such business drivers is really the secret to making sure you get the budgets that you want.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how seeing it from that 10,000-foot view enables you to be better in the weeds, so to speak, right? Be better on the technical side of things and everything. And so it's an interesting perspective that I think people overlook, that they don't put too much weight into it, right? But it would really improve, their workflow and what they're doing and why they're doing it. Well, Amish, this has been a fantastic conversation. But we're at the top of our time here, and I'm always trying to be very cognizant of my guest's time. We're all so very busy. So before I let you go, how about you tell my audience, where they could find you, where they could find your company, if they wanted to learn more and if they wanted to talk to you more about this.
First of all, Joe, it was a pleasure. I always love these podcasts because it goes so fast, and I love the free flowing nature of it. So, and I think we covered a lot of ground here. So, if would love to hear from your listeners. The company website is baffle.io, and I'm Amish D at baffle.io. I look forward to hearing from them.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Amish, and thanks everyone for listening to this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it.